Now, apologetics just means giving reasons for what we believe, why we believe it. And this actually helps us on two fronts. Not only does it help us reach the generation which is walking away from Christianity, because it shows them, oh, there's actually good reason to believe it's true, but it actually helps us within the church as well. Because when we see there's good reason to believe something, we're confident in it. And what happens when we're confident in something? We dedicate ourselves to it, we invest in it. So not only does this help us reach what the people outside the church, it helps us within the church, strengthen us, and help us dedicate to the cause of Christ. So that's why apologetics is a big deal. It was Tim Barnett who said, apologetics is pre-evangelism to the culture and post-evangelism to the church. And I very much agree with that. If you're not doing apologetics, you're really missing out on a whole part of Christianity. So what have we done so far? Over the past 2 months, we've made a case for objective truth. Then we made a case for God, and we saw there's powerful evidence to believe in God. And lastly, we saw that there is indeed the case for miracles. If God exists, miracles are possible. Now, the past 2 weeks, we started going over the resurrection. Now, we saw that if God exists, whether this could happen or not isn't a scientific case, because miracles are possible if God exists. So this is a historical question. Did this actually occur? And we saw that there is indeed historical evidence that it did. Not only are the New Testament documents reliable, they're early, we have a great quantity and quality of these documents. So the writers actually believed this. They actually believed it. They died for it. And this is different from modern Muslim bombers who dedicate their lives to something. They weren't there. They don't know whether it's true or not. They just hope it is. No, these people were there. They saw Jesus. They had good reason to believe that what they believed was true. And they were willing to die to give us this message. So this is all evidence within the Bible, within the early believers. Is there more? Yes, as if that was not enough, there's more. There's extra biblical evidence. That's evidence outside of the Bible. That's what we're going to get to see a little bit of today. Our guest speaker has been doing this for a while on Instagram, giving evidence for the resurrection. So I'm so excited for this. With us today, we have Chris from 1C15 Apologetics. So if you're on Instagram, you definitely want to go check out his profile, 1C15 Apologetics. And then you also want to go see his website. I think it's 1c15.co.uk. So go check that out. There's a ton of great resources. Having said that, I'll pass it on to you, Chris. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Ash. If for whatever reason we'd lost the New Testament and all the copies had gone missing, what would we have left over? This is one such important question. Another great associated question would be, how does external history provide confirmation of what the New Testament historical documents tell us? Now, typically, I could split this up into 4 sections of external history. We have the non-Christian writings, which is what we're looking at today. The non-biblical writings, this can include documents like the Didache, I don't know how you say it, but something like that, the Gospel of Thomas, etc. And there are some other writings. There's also archaeological confirmation, geographical confirmation, the use of name data, places like rivers, etc. All this information would make up a huge case. But we're just doing the first part because that is probably about an hour. We all fought for, I think it's maybe 3.5 or 4 hours, so we're not going to do that. I'm not prepared to do that. So we'll get straight into it. So I'm going to focus mainly on the non-Christian writings, and some of these sources, some of them are really good, like I would say Josephus and Tacitus, which we'll go into a lot of depth on. Then there's people like Thales and Phlegon. I haven't learned how to say his name properly. They're not as good, but they're still very important to know because they exist around the time. Okay, there are 2 general types of sources I want us to look at. There are pagan backgrounds, which generally find Jesus and early Christianity as a nuisance for 300 years. And then we have the Jewish accounts that retaliate in the face of what Jesus has done in order to diminish his ministry and to deter the Jews from joining the Christian sect. Just a quick point I'd like to illustrate before we get into this, because this is important. External evidence is great, but that doesn't diminish the use of the New Testament. Through multiple means of testing the New Testament history, it has provided reliable on many accounts. What we're looking at today doesn't mean you can only use passages from the Bible that are in external non-Christian writings. That would be a rubbish conclusion, because then you'd have to pick and choose bits of the Bible just because some Roman said you could. No, we don't expect every verse to be found in history. We don't have that any historical we don't have that for any document in antiquity. But what we do expect is consistent quantitative confirmation. That is, we expect when they do write to generally confirm the basic facts about Christianity and its historical context. And it's obvious that our main source on Christianity would come from the first century texts, and pretty much every scholar puts them in the first century, except for some fringe scholars that we get into engaging later on. So the four Gospels were, of course, written by advocates of belief in Jesus as the promised deliverer. They may therefore be said to be biased in the sense that they are not impartial records but ones aiming to foster belief in Jesus Christ. However, their bias does not mean we should distrust their record. An innocent man accused of a crime may have deep interest in proving his innocence, but this bias is not a reason to dismiss the evidence he produces. And we wouldn't say this about Holocaust survivors writing up their stories or people writing about the American slavery. We wouldn't dismiss them as biased just because they were there. No, the question then is not whether the Gospels writers had an agenda, but whether they reported accurately the events in question. And this is what external evidence is going to do for us. It helps us say, look, okay, the Gospels say this. Well, we can definitely tell you this, this, and this because we've written this down, and we can align certain dots. Okay, I'm going to move to the next slide. So these sources can't be accused of bias. The sources like Josephus and Tacitus will deal with issues of supposed bias later on. There's a particular passage in Josephus which people question, and we have a good explanation for that. But many non-Christians don't have this issue. Many of the sources today, we don't have the issue of bias. They're mentioning it only because they have to, or because they're trying to respond, not because they have any attempt to endorse Christianity. Okay, so that's introductions down. Let's get into the sources because I think I've got about 60 slides worth. So let's not beat around the bush or take too long. I don't know how that translates. So the pagan sources are generally hostile to Christianity. Some ancient authors denied the miraculous nature of Jesus and the events surrounding his life. What is useful about such accounts is they have no genuine interest in promoting Christianity, just stating them only when necessary, as we've kind of covered. Some only mentioned by name if really necessary. So to the Romans, you didn't want to devote too much of your papyrus to a subject to someone who's a troublemaker. It's just not. If a Roman spent a lot of time talking about Jesus, you'd start to think they liked the guy, and you wouldn't do that as a Roman. You'd want to give your emperor the most of the paper, and the guys who are causing you problems as little as you can. Okay, so the first guy we're going to get into is a guy called Thallus. Now, Thallus was an early historian who wrote in Koine Greek, which is what we call the Bible Greek. He wrote a 3-volume history in the Mediterranean world from before the Trojan War. Most of his work, like most of ancient literature, is lost. Luckily, his work survives in a series of quotes. He is quoted by Sextus Julius Africanus in his History of the World in the 200s AD. It is not known precisely when he lived and wrote, but his work is quoted by Theophilus of Antioch, who died in around 185 AD. And most scholars put Thallus's writings around 50 AD. So Thallus is by far the earliest secular writer to mention Christianity in any form. And it seems to have survived from antiquity through quotes. There is also another mention of Thallus mentioned in Josephus, someone around not long after Thallus would have been around. Now, there's not too much to say about this because some have said, oh, there could be another Thallus, but this is Thallus. It's a historian. Josephus might be referring to a historian as well. It could be the same person, but I'm not going to pin all our hopes on that. So let's see what the quote does say. So this is one of the earlier sources. It says, on the whole world, there was pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus in the 3rd book of his history calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse from the sun. So from what we can just grab from that, we can certainly see Jesus lived. Jesus was crucified. There was an earthquake. And there was darkness at the point of Jesus' crucifixion. In the context this quote is used, Africanus is only quoting Thallus because he wants to refute him. He wants to challenge him. He's not saying, hey, look, Thallus is backing me up. No, that's not his goal at all. We should also mention this earthquake. This is a little bit of archaeology. This is a slight tangent. We have actually great data about an earthquake around the time of Jesus. So when we hear about this earthquake at the cross, Thallus talking about it, we actually have great archaeological evidence. And I don't know how clear this is. Basically, there are two earthquakes which correlate around the time of Christ, one overlapping the whole period entirely, and one 31, 32 AD. Okay. Now we're on to our second bloke. I'm going to speed through some of the smaller ones because we've got some more impressive ones later, which I think we find a lot more interesting. Phlegon, AD to 140 AD, is also mentioned by Julius Africanus as a historian who wrote a chronology of history around the 140 AD. And in this history, Phlegon also mentions the darkness surrounding the crucifixion. So we're seeing it's mentioned again. This same situation as before. Africanus isn't interested in saying, hey, look, we have another first century historian. No, that's just collateral. His interest is in responding to the skeptical viewpoint that was being portrayed at the time. And let's see what he says. Phlegon records that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to the 9th hour. And now Phlegon is actually multiply attested. He's also quoted by Origen, a 2nd to 3rd century writer, also makes use of him. Here's what he has to say. Now, Phlegon, in the 13th or the 14th book, I think, of his chronicles, not only ascribed to Jesus as a knowledge of future events, but also testified that the results corresponded to his predictions. And with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place, Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he arose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment, and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. Interesting quote. So if we were just to grab a few bullet points from that, we could say Jesus has the accurate ability to predict the future. He was crucified under the reign of Tiberius Caesar, presented his wounds after he was resurrected, and darkness was at the time of Christ's crucifixion. Okay, Suetonius. Now, if you've ever watched a Roman documentary, this guy gets mentioned a lot. And I'm a bit of a Roman history nerd, so I quite like Suetonius. He tells us quite a lot. He is of the time period between 69 to 140, was a Roman historian and an analyst of the imperial house under the Emperor Hadrian. He mentions a riot in Rome that led to Emperor Claudius expelling Jews from Rome in AD 49. That when Claudius died in 54 AD, some were able to return to Rome if they wanted. Suetonius accounts for this expulsion occurring at the instigation of someone named Chrestus, a variant form of the word Christus, which, long story short, refers to Jesus Christ. And there's plenty of historians who will back me up on that. I'm aware that there are some fringe scholars have chosen to declare a cult of a similar name, the cult of Chrestus, but not many people buy that. And there's very few people who hold that. So not going to engage in that here. Suetonius is also not writing directly about Jesus, but writing reflectively about a people, not Jesus Christ himself as a person, which explains the time he's writing slightly after. Suetonius's writings about Christians describe their treatment under Emperor Claudius, the guy we mentioned with Phlegon. He says, because the Jews at Rome caused constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, that's Christ, he, Claudius, expelled them from the city of Rome. Now, the reason why I put some of these things in brackets is because we have a much larger passage, and I don't want to put, let's say, 20 lines in there. But if you look up Suetonius's writings, you can see the before and after if you want. We have another quote. This expulsion took place in 49 AD, and in another work, Suetonius writes about the fire which destroyed Rome in 64 AD. And under the reign of Nero, Nero blamed the Christians for this fire, and he punished Christians severely as a result. And he says in the simple line, Nero inflicted punishment on the Christians, a sect given to a new and mischievous religious belief. You notice how they don't want to write too much about Christ, but enough to make the point known. Like I was saying earlier, the Romans don't want to devote too much papyrus unless they really had to. So what does Suetonius tell us? Well, Jesus had an immediate impact on his followers. They were committed to the belief that Jesus was God, underwent and withstood torment and punishment from the Roman Empire. Christianity was new to them. This is not something that existed for hundreds of years. You're not going to put Christianity in the 3rd century BC. This is something new. They were becoming aware of it. And finally, Jesus was referred to as Christ in Gentile territories, which is exactly what Paul says. Paul refers to Jesus as the Christ throughout his letters. If you notice in your New Testament, that is actually what Paul does. And it makes complete sense. And it makes complete sense of history as well. That's the name they pick up on. Tacitus. Now, he's one of our favorite guys for the night. Cornelius Tacitus, who has a very awesome name to start with, was known for his analysis and examination of historical documents and is among the most trusted of ancient historians. He was a senator under Emperor Vespasian and was also a proconsul of Asia. He is now most famed for his writings, for which there are plenty. Also getting a brief history lesson, I've realized, as I've been doing this. Tacitus certainly had biases, and this is important to note. He recounted history in order to give moral instruction, praising those he approved of, and often applying a whole armory of rhetorical strategies to damn those he disliked. Christianity isn't going to come well out of this. Believe it or not, he's not praising us. However, his first-rate ability to record factual information was brilliant. He appears to have had access to sources that allowed him to relate detailed stories from more than four decades before he was born. He therefore had little reason to doubt the broad facts underlying his account of the early Christians, as found in his annals. We'll get into this a bit later. And he isn't that distant from the time of Christ either. So he certainly was familiar with them as a neighbor he was not a big fan of. To back up what I'm saying, I'm not just saying, oh, Tacitus is awesome because I say so. The Oxford Companion to Classical Literature states that the Annals in particular show Tacitus to have been one of the greatest historians, with a penetrating insight into character and sober grasp of the significant issues of the time. And I could give you about 20 more quotes, but I'm going to be cautious of time and just give you that one. Now, Tacitus wrote about the Great Fire in Rome, which was in July AD 64, which told of how basically it was blamed on the Christians by Nero. And Tacitus would have been able to talk about many of these situations because he had access to Roman official records. And he writes about this, he tells us about this. And we therefore have every reason to treat the outline of his facts provided as reliable. We also know Suetonius talks about similar events, at least in brief in contrast. So Tacitus gives us a little bit more depth because he has to for his intention. So this is how Tacitus tells the story, using the common early spelling of Christians as Christians. You'll see quite a few of these misspellings, but yeah, there's never a consistent misspelling. They have lots of little variants. Okay, but neither human help nor gifts from the emperor, nor all scandal ways of placating heaven could stifle, scandal, or dispel the belief that the fire had taken place by order of Nero. Therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinement of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd called Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, but the home of the disease, but in the capital of Rome itself. Oh, this is long. Where all things horrible or shameful in the first world collect and become fashionable, first then the confessed members of the sect were arrested. Next on the disclosures, vast numbers were convicted, not so much on the count of arson for hatred of the human race, and derision accompanied their end. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs. Or they were fastened on crosses, and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle and given an exhibition in circus, mixing with the crowd in the clothes of the charioteer and the mounted of his chariot. Hence, in spite of any guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, there arose a sentiment of pity due to the impression that they were being sacrifices not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. Now, I'm not going to read out all the quotes in these slides because there are some very long quotes, but you noticed I put some words in bold, and this is to help pull out the facts, because we have another quote later on, and it's about 7 slides. So I'm not going to read you 7 slides. I think that's going to take about 5 minutes. And I'm pretty dyslexic, so my reading abilities can be pretty atrocious sometimes in some of these quotes. Now, such an allegation has arisen against Tacitus from some of the liberal skeptics. Could it be possible that the works of pagan writers were tampered by Christian scribes? Well, first, it should be remembered that all Greek and Latin literature transmitted to us from the classical period of the Middle Ages was handed to by Christian scribes. So these Christians preserved the references to Greek and Roman gods and faithfully copied religious ideas that were so anti-Christian, but they were interested in recording history. In the last century or so, much older manuscripts from before Christian times have been found in the dry sands of Egypt, and these show that the scribes generally copied faithfully where they can be checked. Therefore, the burden is on those who want to maintain that Tacitus' documents have been tampered with to come up with the proof. To this date, there is no proof against that view. There is a single example in Josephus, but even then, we have access to an untampered version now. So that problem erases itself, and we'll get into that because not everyone is aware of this untampered version. They still pin it on this reconstruction. Secondly, Tacitus had a unique style of Latin, part of which is commonly known as Silver Latin, which is to distinguish it from the Latin Golden Age of Cicero. It's a different type of Latin, not Gold Latin, I think. As the centuries passed, Latin changed. As with all languages, medieval scribes were educated in medieval Latin and would not have been aware of all the differences between their own Latin and the Latin of Tacitus. It wouldn't have been easy for them to implicate Tacitus' style of Latin for more than a few phrases at most. That is why classical scholars today treat this as a reliable account, at least in regard to the main events. And third, Tacitus doesn't really like the Christians. I mean, if you notice earlier, he referred to the Christians as a disease. So he's not in the business of bigging us up, really. So a few quick objections and responses that we can put to this quote. There is the use of an anachronistic title in Tacitus. That is to say, the title is given the wrong form from the time period. The response to this is Tacitus called Pilate procurator, yet the Pilate stone from archaeology and the Bible called him a prefect. Josephus and Philo both call him procurator. However, Josephus sometimes uses the terms interchangeably. So this isn't an impressive objection. They just choose to give him one title and somewhere else they use him another. And this isn't just Josephus, this is Philo as well, another Jewish historian. Another objection, did Tacitus rely on hearsay? Tacitus refers to the Christian leader as Christus. This is not the same as Jesus, and they suggest that Tacitus was dependent on popular Christian myths over reliable, independent information. Well, we have a response to this, and it looks a lot more intimidating on my slides. It's not my script. In context, the passage is referring to Christians and not specifically Jesus. He mentions the term Christus to explain the origin of the term Christians. Using the name Jesus would probably just confuse the audience since they're talking about the Christ. Christ, Christian, it's a lot easier to explain. So historically, Tacitus is very well known for checking his sources, and considering this writing was subject to an official action taken by a Roman emperor, he would have every reason to be very careful. And I would recommend, if you ever get Tacitus's works, read through them back to front. It'll take a while, but it's really interesting just to see what type of person he is. I can only give you a small taster here. Tacitus also shows a consistent interest in the royal family members who became associated or part of the Christian movement. Now, in the late 90s AD, not 1990s, 90s, the very first, Domitian's niece, Domitilla, and her husband, Fabius Clemens, were accused of atheism, being carried away into Jewish customs. So believe it or not, being a Christian was being considered an atheist back then. It's quite a contrast today. And there are the same things the early Christians were accused of which explains why Tacitus refers to Christians as a pernicious superstition. Also, Tacitus doesn't seem to have got his information from the New Testament, as scholar Robert van Woest makes clear, with no literary or oral dependence, and the wording is very different. So basically, when Tacitus talks about Christianity, you will not find anything similar in the New Testament or Christian writings. So he's not pulling something from somewhere else. He's writing fresh from a different source or another Roman historian. Another objection: would Tacitus have access to official documents? Our response is he's held several government posts. He was friends with Pliny the Younger, who we will quote later, governor of Bithynia, which we discover in other works, and he was married to the daughter of Britain's governor and was connected into Roman governance. We know he has access to the Roman Senate archives, and he cites them twice in his works. Any official communications about Jesus' crucifixion would likely be found in these archives. But just imagine if you had access to the Roman archives today, if they didn't get absolutely pillaged and ruined and destroyed by 1,000 years of Roman barbarians pillaging the empire. Honestly, I wonder what they would have said about Jesus. We would have a lot more interesting insight. But we don't, we have this. So we've looked at Tacitus's credentials, quotes from him, and responded to popular objections from fringe scholars like, you may have heard of Richard Carrier or Bob Price. These are the people we've been engaging with for the past few slides, who for whatever reason go against the typical response of what historians say about Tacitus. So what can we learn about Tacitus? Well, judging by the amount of bullet points, this is why we spent so long on him. He can tell us that Christians held to moral beliefs that were countercultural. Tacitus refers to Christus, the Latin word for where Christ derives from, as the leader of the Christian movement. Tacitus says it was the crowds that named them Christians. We see similar in Acts 11, where it says they were first called Christians in Antioch. This was to do with the time of Christ. Christ was put to death under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, so between 14 to 37 AD, which is when he reigned. Pontius Pilate was in charge of Judea at the time, so that's 26 to 36 AD. The superstition could be associated with the miraculous claims of Christ, which died down at the death and then arose again not long after. This is as generous as Tacitus is going to get. Christianity started in Judea, which aligns with what Christian sources say. Also, 64 AD was where the vast multitude of Christians in Rome, Peter and Paul, were said to be in Rome or around Rome this time. So when you date the New Testament documents, we do put books like the Book of Romans and some of the Gospels can easily be dated towards the early 60s, but that's another case altogether. And the more Christians, the harder it is to alter the teachings, providing confidence in the Gospels, for example. I might have skipped part of my bullet point, but it's clear there. And Christians were treated cruelly for their religion, and they were persecuted. Now, the next historian, not as much on this guy, but it's still interesting. Celsus. He was quite antagonistic to the claims of the Gospels, but his criticism was he unknowingly affirmed and reinforced the biblical authors and their content. In fact, his writing is so extensive, he alludes to 80 different quotes from the Bible. He essentially, through his quotes, affirms 4 Gospels, which is great for us. We've got a guy who's a skeptic of the New Testament, but he definitely uses 4 Gospels and not a 5th, not a 6th, not a 7th, not a whatever. No, he knows what the New Testament texts are. And in addition, he admits the miracles of Jesus were generally believed in the 2nd century. He writes, Jesus had come from a village in Judea and was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out by the doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, and on being convicted of adultery, being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers, which Egypt prided themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god. Now, you see, if you're a critic of Christianity, this is the sort of case you were making back then. You see people try to create cases like this today. But yeah, this is basically, he takes the Christian story and says, no, if I was to change it, how would it respond to? And he also looked at what the Jews responded to at the time. Things just like, oh, they stole the body from the tomb and things like that. He would have access to the Jewish narratives, and that would be great for him in his debate circle. So what does Celsus give us after his slew of attacks? Well, Jesus came from a village in Judea. His family wasn't very wealthy. Mary was convicted of adultery. You can see how that plays to the virgin birth and Joseph not knowing and accusing her. But Celsus Through this, admits Jesus was reportedly born of a virgin, but then argues this supernatural account could not be possible, and offers the idea that Jesus was an illegitimate son of a man named Panthera, which is an idea borrowed by the Jews opposing Jesus. There's an interesting history behind where that name comes from. It's more of a mash of words. Jesus had traveled to Egypt at a time in his life, which is very early on in the Gospels, and that Jesus was seen as a god and that he had miraculous power. So from a skeptic who has no interest in helping us, he gives us quite a lot of information to work with. I'm not complaining. Pliny the Younger. Now, he writes quite a lot, so I'm just going to read the bold bits because I think I have about 5 slides. But basically, Pliny is writing to Trajan for help on how to deal with these annoying Christians who are doing their certain practices. But this is the useful thing. He's complaining about Christians and what to do with them, but through that, he mentions what they were doing. And this is what we'll find interesting from these slides. So I'm just going to read around the bold words. So having never been presented at any of the trials of Christians, so we know there were trials, I interrogated them whether they were Christians. If they confessed it, I repeated the question a second and a third time. Now think about Peter. How many times was he asked at the end of John's Gospel? Adding the threat of capital punishment. There were others also possessed with the same madness, but being citizens of Rome, I directed them to be sent there. Their accusations spread, so the Christian message is spreading. Those who denied that they were or had ever been Christians, who repeated after me an invocation of the gods and offered ordination with wine and incense to your statue, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the images and gods, and finally cursed Christ all things, it is said that no real Christians can be forced to do, and I thought they should be discharged. This is very interesting to think that real Christians cannot deny Christ. This is something they were seeing and had policies to do. Okay, back to the bold text. In the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day. Now we all know we meet on Sundays. This is referring to this fixed day. Before it was like and singing an alternative verse, a hymn to Christ as God. That's important. Binding themselves by a solemn oath, not to wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor to deny a pledge when they were called upon to deliver up. Now, this is sounding very, very much like what we can read in the New Testament. And we're getting this from Pliny, who's planning against us. And then resemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So some have suggested this is the bread and the water. From 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. So we know, I'm not going to get into the church controversy about deacons, deaconesses, and can women lead in the church. But what we have here is there were 2 female deaconesses. So deacons certainly exist. Okay, back to the bold text. Considering the number of endangered, many persons of all ages and ranks and of both sexes are being and will be called to trial for this contagious superstition. Is not confined only to the cities, but also has spread through the villages and rural districts. Their temples, more bold text further below, their temples which had almost become deserted, which says something as to what was happening to Roman culture with these Christians around. Now, Trajan's response is, he essentially says, you're doing a good job. And I won't go into the script. Basically, he's admiring Pliny for what he's doing, and he's saying, keep going. There are things you can do here and here and here, but generally, you're doing all right. But what can we know from all of this? Because he tells us quite a lot. Christians were put on trial. Christians were often tested 3 times, which has got this interesting parallel to Peter. So Jesus denying Peter 3 times has almost become like a practice or a little rule people have added along to living as a Christian. Citizens of Rome were Christians, and Christianity was spreading. The Christians held to just one God and cannot worship any other God and still be a Christian. Christians were in the habit of meeting on a fixed day every week to worship Jesus as God, and hymns were sung to Christ as God, following Christ's teaching as their moral compass. Christians took part in the Lord's Supper. There were deacons, deaconesses. There were Christians of varying ages, young and old. It spread to the rich, to the poor, to the cities and villages. There were so many Christians, the pagan temples were becoming deserted. And these practices were widespread, and thus he was asking Trajan for advice. Trajan was aware of Christ, as you see in his response, as Christ was treated as a deity. Adoration of any other god would no longer make that person a Christian. And in the year 111 AD, many years prior, Christians were having meetings. So we get quite a lot from Pliny. And if you want to see what it says on each slide, I'm sure you can see it in the recording. Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satiricist. I always think of this as the earliest Jimmy Carr or like some kind of comedian of some kind. I don't think his work's too funny personally, but he was a Greek satirist who spoke sarcastically of Christ and Christians. But in the process, he did affirm they were real people and never spoke of them as fictional characters. The Christians, we're reading this quote now, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immoral for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common amongst them. And then it was impressed on them by the original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted, and they deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and lived after his laws. All this they take quite possibly on faith, with the results that they, despite all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. And that's written in the Death of Pilgrim. So what can we know from Lucian? Well, Christians worship a man, we're referring as Jesus, bought a teaching and was crucified for it. Christians believed in one God. The teachings were quickly adopted by Jesus's followers. Christians had strong conviction that they had an eternal life in their belief. Christians were fearless of death. And Christians do not live for worldly pleasures, which we would say is turning away from sinful desires. Now, our final pagan source, before we get into the Jewish side, which I assure you is a lot shorter. A Syrian philosopher named Marabar Serapion, who wrote just after 70 AD, which is an important moment in Jewish history. The sack of Jerusalem started in 67 and concluded by 70 AD. He was writing to encourage his son and compared the life and persecution of Jesus with that of other philosophers who were persecuted for their ideas. The fact Jesus is known to be a real person, this kind of influence is important, and it certainly got around to this guy. Whether he was in Syria, I don't know. I don't actually know where he was writing from. Marabar Serapion refers to Jesus as a wise king, as we read. What benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as judgment for their crime. Or the people, Samos, for burning Pythagoras. In one moment, their country was covered with sand. Or the Jews by murdering their wise king. After that, their kingdom was abolished, which is the sack of Jerusalem. God rightly avenged these men. The wise king lived on in the teachings he enacted. So, murdering their wise king, now around the time of Marabar, only Jesus does this and is killed for it. You can look up the history of other self-proclaimed messiahs. None of them fit the same bill. So Marabar tells us that Jesus was seen as wise, Jesus seen as king of the Jews, that the Jewish nation had been abolished, that Jesus had teachings which live on. Jesus died for his beliefs. The Jewish leadership were responsible for his death. Jesus' followers adopted his beliefs and lived their lives accordingly. Okay, that's the halfway point. The second half is shorter. So in addition to the classical pagan sources, chronicling the life of Jesus and his followers, there are also a number of ancient hostile Jewish sources describing Jesus. These are written by Jewish theologians, historians, and leaders who are definitely not sympathetic to the Christian cause. Their writings are often very harsh, very critical, and even demeaning to Jesus. But there is still much these writings confirm through what they concede. So Flavius Josephus is our most interesting person out of these sources. He was born around 37 to 38 AD, so after Christ, interestingly, and died around 100 AD. Josephus was a commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee during their initial rebellion against Rome in 66 AD. He was captured by the Romans in 67 AD and claims to have predicted that Vespasian would become emperor in July 69 AD. Josephus found favor with Vespasian after this, and subsequent emperors became a citizen of Rome and took the name Flavius in accordance with Vespasian's family name. Josephus is the single most important historian for events in the first century Palestine, and is of particular interest since his history, Jewish Antiquities, speaks about Jesus Christ and also John the Baptist, a major figure in the Gospels. In fact, he is the best non-Christian source commentary on the details in the Gospels. The Greek manuscripts of Josephus's Jewish Antiquities mention Jesus Christ in 2 places, of which one is judged by many scholars to be a secondary edition, if we're basing it on the early version, or to have suffered contamination during the textual copying. And we'll get into why we can challenge this assumption based on another manuscript. One of those works is his now famous Antiquities of the Jews, which he finished in 93 AD. In Book 18, Chapter 3 of Section 3 of that work, Josephus, who was not a Christian, wrote these words. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one which performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He had won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when upon accused of the principle of men among us, Pilate had condemned him to the cross, those who had appeared first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a 3rd day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold of these things and thousands other marvels about him. And the tribe of Christians so called after them has still to this day not disappeared. Now, if this is a Jew and he's not a Christian, you are rightly and correctly suspicious. There is definitely a sense of interpolation, and even agnostic critics like Bart Ehrman, who is a scholar, says the majority of scholars think the majority of scholars of early Judaism and experts on Josephus think that one or more Christian scribes touched up this specific passage for a bit. I mean, if you're going to take a passage, touch it up. This was a good one for them. Now, it seems highly unlikely that Josephus would have said Jesus was the Messiah and state that on the 3rd day Jesus was restored to life. Also, the saying, if one should call him a man, is also suspicious. Christians had a lot more admiration for Josephus than perhaps many Jews because of his details about 1st century Christianity. And this is also a Jewish historian who essentially betrayed the Jewish people and joined the Romans. We see the story of Matthew like that as well, a Roman tax collector, and decides to join Jesus. But of course, he was taxing the Jews prior to that. Again, so we can understand such a hostility existing. Later manuscripts have emerged without these 3 questionable statements, which suggest that this theory may be accurate. So scholars, just because they have identified one doctored paragraph, don't throw out the entire document, and we'll get into why. This is what a scholarly reconstruction looks like of the passages with Josephus's style in mind, and removing the biases put together by Professor John P. Meyer. Now I'll read this and we'll contrast it to the next slide, which should be very informative. It says, similarly, now around this time lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was a worker of amazing deeds and was a teacher of people who gladly accepted the truth. He won over many Jews and many Greeks. Pilate, when he heard of him, accused by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross. But those who had first loved him did not cease to doing so to this day. The tribe of Christians named after him had not disappeared. So here, he's not saying he's the Messiah. He's not saying he's a worker of miracles. No, this is all stripped out in this reconstruction. But we don't need necessarily a reconstruction, because a great scholar in 1971 named Shlomo Pines, a scholar of ancient languages and distinguished professor of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, published a long-lost 10th century Arabic text written by the Melkite bishop of Hierapolis named Agapius. This Arabic leader quoted Josephus and did so in the Arabic language. And unlike the Greek version, they didn't get their hands on this one to tamper it. So we have an untampered version. Overtly, the Christian references that are seen in other ancient versions in the Greek are missing from Agabus's text. And as a result, scholars believe that this version best reflects Josephus' original text. Now we'll read this one, and you'll see how it contrasts with the first one and how it sounds pretty similar to the reconstruction. It says, at this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So again, not quite the same as the previous slide, but it's definitely not as elaborate as the interpolation. And this is important because we get quite a lot of information about this. There was another quote, which we'll mention before we get to our concluding slide, on Josephus. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road, and he, Ananus, the high priest, is that meant to be Ananias? That's probably my bad. Assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. When he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stones. So Josephus doesn't only mention Jesus, he also talks about James. So my quotes are in places. Josephus also confirms Jesus was the brother of James and John the Baptist, who was beheaded by Herod Antipas. That is in Antiquities 18:5-2. Now, there are some objections, and I've got some short responses to them. So first one, if you remove the testimonium from its larger context, the previous paragraph flows together. So this section seems conspicuously out of place. Now, the response is, this isn't rare for an author to digress. We find this elsewhere in Josephus's writings, where he often what appears to go on a tangent and then he quickly gets back on the road. So this is actually very consistent with what Josephus does. So for this paragraph to not look like it's meant to be there is entirely ideal for what Josephus might do. Next objection, no Christian mentions this passage until the 4th century. Well, this is just an argument from silence. What would early Christians use this passage for? That Jesus was wise and did great deeds and had a big following? Well, who's denying that early on? The early apologists who used Josephus didn't need to use this passage in their apologetic for the cases they need to make. The concerns of the 2nd century critics are simply different from the 20th century critics. Today, we have people who deny Jesus even existed. They didn't have that issue back then. In the 18th century, people thought Jesus might be drawn from paganism. Again, this is not anything you find in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century. Okay, another objection. Why wasn't Josephus harsher with Jesus than he was with other fake messiahs? Well, the response again here is easy. Jesus wasn't a military messiah, striking down the Roman soldiers, leading a rebellion. You got to remember, Josephus works for the Romans. There just wasn't as many things to say compared to these false messiahs. A lot of these messiahs were very violent. Josephus works for the Romans now. He wants to stay in good favor. And so when these fake messiahs go down taking out Romans, not only are they false messiahs, but he can please the Jews by saying they were false messiahs, and he can please the Romans. Jesus, however, it's mainly the Jewish audience and not too much on the Romans immediately. Obviously, this conflict escalates over time. Josephus would not have called him wise. Response. Well, we don't know how familiar he was with Jesus' teachings, but Jesus did teach many things Jewish rabbis would endorse and support, since a lot of the Old Testament teachings were fluent in Christ's teachings. If he was taking the Old Testament and advancing it, like we see a lot in the Sermon on the Mount, they probably would be considered a wise guy. Next objection, final objection. Josephus wouldn't have called him Christ. Well, response. Jesus does mention many other Jesuses, as it was a common name in his works. This was a distinguisher for him, and also so he doesn't call him Christ, but a so-called Christ. He's very careful there not to call him the Christ. So he's not endorsing him. As well as this, Origen does quote this passage, and that means it has been quoted very on in history. So after all that, What can Josephus tell us, and why have we spent so much time on it? Well, he tells us Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar in Palestine. He was a wise and virtuous teacher. He demonstrated his power. He was condemned and crucified under Pontius Pilate, had followers who reported that he appeared to them after his death on the cross. He was believed to be the Messiah. Jesus had a brother named James. The Jewish leadership felt compelled to kill James. Jesus was called the Christ, and people from many nations became Christians. That's why we spent so much time backing up Josephus, because this guy's around in the first century, writing in the first century, and he's talking about Christ and key events in the Christian story. The Jewish Talmud. Now, this is generally compiled between 400 to 700 AD. This encyclopedia, basically, is not just from 400 AD onwards, but what they're doing is they're taking a lot of oral tradition, prior Jewish history, from the Tananaic period, from 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. So it's not just they start at 400, we're having material even before Jesus in these books. So we're getting old texts in there. And unfortunately, they don't have the Harvard referencing where they reference which book they've done and what year they accessed it in. That would be great to have, but they didn't do that back then. And scholars believe there are a number of Talmudic writings referring to Jesus. And many of these writings are said to use code words to describe Jesus, such as Balaam or Ben Stada, or a very certain one. But for our purposes, we'll be very conservative and limit our explanation to the passages referring to Jesus in a more direct way. So fly through the quotes now. Jesus practiced magic and led Israel astray. There's 3 references there. Rabbi Hizda said that Rabbi Jeremiah bar Abba said, What is that which is written? No evil will befall you, yet nor shall any plague come near your house. No evil will befall you means that evil dreams and evil thoughts will not tempt you, nor shall any plague come near your house, means that you will not have a son or a disciple who burns his food like Jesus of Nazareth. Hopefully I'm saying these rabbis' names correctly. I'm pretty terrible with names. Okay, next passage. Our rabbis have taught that Jesus had 5 disciples, Matthai, Nakai, Nezer, Buni, and Todah. They brought Matthai to trial. He said, Must Matthai be killed? For it is written, When Matthai shall I come and appear before God? They said to him, Yes, Matthai must be killed, for it is written, When he dies, his name will perish. They brought Nakai. He said to them, Must Nakai be killed? For it is written, The innocent and the righteous will not slay. They to him, Yes, Nakai must be killed, for it is written, In secret places he slays the innocent. I'm trying to read around the brackets, but there's a lot of brackets in there. Next quote. It was taught on the day before Passover, they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days, proclaiming he himself would be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in favor come forward and plead for him. But nothing was found in his favor. And they hanged him on the day before the Passover. So the Talmud presents 1st century sources through to the 5th and beyond. And this tells us some interesting beliefs about the Jewish Talmudic writers. Jesus had magical powers, and they clearly found it hard to deny. And this would meet the scholarly criteria of embarrassment. He led Jews away from their beliefs, disciples who were martyred for their faith, was executed on the day before Passover. Now, we're not saying every word for word is exactly what happened, but we're saying the Jews at the time, the Pharisee tradition, which is the one that continues on, I believe, they have their version of events and their propaganda version. This is the story they are telling people because obviously they don't believe the Christian story. Now, we have one final source. Now, this is 1000 AD. This is a bit cheeky for me to put this one in there, but there's a reason for it. It is a medieval retelling of the life of Jesus, and it is completely anti-Christian, which is the very reason for me wanting to include it. And there are many versions of these retellings. You can find retellings before the Toledo Yeshu and ones after. Again, I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering how to say that. Some of the sources in this text sound like things from the Talmud or sources from the Romans or earlier. Basically, it sounds like it's quoting material a lot older than it is. The Toledo Yeshu contains and is determined to explain away the miracles of Jesus and to deny his virgin birth. And in some places, the text is quite aggressive. but it does verify many elements of the New Testament teachings. Considering some of these stories could be linked to the first century oral tradition propaganda of the Jews, this document is helpful in establishing what Jews over the first millennium confess. Jesus is referred to as Yehoshua in this text, just so you get a little bit of context. Now, there's a lot of text, so I'm going to read the bold bits. So the bold bits, it was a man of the tribe of Judah. That should sound familiar if you know your New Testament and Old. Miriam believe Miriam is Mary, gave birth to a son, named him Yahushua, Jesus, after her brother. This name later deteriorated into Yeshu, is the Jewish name for Jesus. It means, may his name be blotted out. So not particularly kind here. Lots and lots of story between. Feel free to read it in your own time. Yeshu proclaimed, I am the Messiah, and concerning me, Isaiah prophesied and said, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Interestingly, that's what a lot of Christians did back then, and it's what a lot of us say now. David, my ancestor, prophesied concerning me. The Lord said to me, thou art my son. The day have I begotten thee. Skip to the next bit. Yeshu spoke over the man the letters of the ineffable name, and the leper was healed. Worshipped him as the Messiah, son of the highest. The Sanhedrin decided to bring about the capture of Yeshu. Next bit, acquired an ass, which is a donkey for modern ears. Many of the old-fashioned words sound a little bit weird back then for our modern hearing, on which he rode into Jerusalem as a fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah. Next bold bit, a dead body was brought in. He pronounced the letters of the ineffable name, and the corpse came to life. Next bold bit, he proclaimed himself the Son of God. Oh, they found him a in Galilee. I should have bolded that too. That's interesting. They gave him vinegar to drink. On his head, they set a crown of thorns. Sound familiar? Yeshu remained until the eve of Passover. This is remained on the cross. Yeshu was put to death on the 6th hour on the eve of Passover and of the Sabbath. I believe that's in another source we've talked about tonight as well. On the first day of the week, his bold followers came to Queen Helene with the report that he who was slain was truly the Messiah, that he was not in his grave. So you can read all of that. I haven't, because I think we way beyond an hour, and I'm trying desperately to keep it under an hour if I can. So if you do read this all, you'll realize it's a large piece of anti-Christian propaganda. I'm not surprised. I mean, but what does this document tell us? Well, it says Mary gave birth to a son named Jesus. The Jewish leaders disliked Jesus. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Jesus claimed to be born of a virgin. Jesus claimed to fulfill prophecy. He claimed to be of the line of David. Jesus healed a leper. I think I put pepper. I'm not meant to say that. Jesus healed a leper before the Jewish leaders. Jewish leadership took Jesus as a prisoner. Jesus rode on a donkey into Jerusalem. Jesus was worshipped as Messiah. Jesus raised a corpse to life, Lazarus likely. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, said Isaiah foretold his life, beaten with rods, given vinegar to drink, betrayed by a man named Judas Iscariote, which sounds quite familiar. Jesus had a crown of thorns affixed to his head prior to the crucifixion. Jesus was killed on the eve of Passover. Jesus' grave was empty on the first day of the week, which is Sunday to them. Jesus had followers who claimed he was resurrected and ascended. Now, that's a lot of points. Luckily, I've added them all up, so then you don't have to go through all of them and find them all. So when we take all of them, what do we have? Okay, I have a couple of slides of this, so I'll quickly fly through them. Jesus lived, brought a teaching, and was crucified for it. Teachings were quickly adopted by Jesus' followers, was condemned and crucified under Pontius Pilate. Jesus was crucified. Jesus was executed on the day before Passover. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar in Palestine. There was an earthquake at the point of Jesus' crucifixion, and the darkness at the point of Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus had the accurate ability to predict the future. Jesus, under the reign of Tiberius Caesar, presented his wounds after he was resurrected. Jesus had immediate impact on his followers. These followers underwent and withstood torment and punishment from the Roman Empire. Christianity was new to Rome, not something from hundreds of years ago, but growing in their time. Jesus was referred to as Christ in Gentile territories, which is corroborating what Paul does. Christians worshipped a man named Jesus. Jesus' followers were committed to the belief that Jesus was God. Christians believed in one God. Christians had strong conviction they had an eternal life in their belief. Christians were put on trial. Christians were often tested 3 times, which is the parallel to Peter. So Peter's testing. Citizens of Rome were Christians. Christians were fearless of death. Christians do not live for worldly pleasures. Jesus was seen as wise. Jesus seen as a king of the Jews. The Jewish nation abolished after the death of Jesus. The Jewish leadership were responsible for Jesus' death. Christians were in the habit of meeting on a fixed day every week to worship Jesus. And there's more. Hymns were sung to Christ as God. Christianity spread fast. These practices were widespread and thus asking of Trajan for advice. Trajan was aware of Christ as deity, and adoration of any other god would no longer make that individual a Christian. Christians took part in the Lord's Supper. There were deacons and deaconesses. There were Christians of varying ages, young and old. It spread to the rich, the poor, to the cities and villages. There were so many Christians, the pagan temples were becoming deserted. Jesus came from a village in Judea. His family wasn't wealthy. Mary was convicted of adultery. Jesus had an earthly guardian who was a carpenter, explaining his own profession. Jesus had traveled to Egypt at the time in his life. Jesus has miraculous powers, led Jews away from their beliefs. Jesus had a brother named James. The Jewish leadership felt compelled to kill James. Jesus was called the Christ. People from many nations became Christians, had followers who reported that he appeared to them after his death on the cross. Says it was the crowds that named him Christians. See Acts 11, where it says they were first called Christians in Antioch. Christians started in Judea, which aligns with Christians also. In 64 AD, there was a vast multitude of Christians in Rome. Now we also have the Toledo Yeshu facts. I'll just leave them up there just to make it easier, because I've just read out 54 facts, and this is 54 plus 13. So you end up with, I think it's 13. So you end up with quite a few. But I'll conclude on this. Sorry for the cheesy graphic, but I felt like it best interpreted what I wanted to say. If Christianity were possibly true and grew through the first few centuries, we expect maybe some non-Christian sources to talk about it in history. Christianity is discussed by a handful of reliable early non-Christian sources, more than we'd expect, which testifies to the impact of Christianity. Jesus and the Christian movement were clearly known and established in the first century, with many of the core beliefs they hold to today established in non-Christian writings. And we only went through about 10, 15 writings. There are actually 42 other writings I could have talked about today. These are other Christians. These are heretics who have no interest in Christianity, no interest in mainstream Christianity, but were alternating it in their own versions. But that's a whole presentation in itself, and probably a lot longer. And we also have the archaeological evidence, the geographical evidence. So we've done 25% of just the external evidence. If the New Testament documents were on trial for being accused of making things up, we have a strong witness. And today, the non-Christian writings have been in, I don't know what you call it, the booth, the sand. I've tried to use an American scene just to make it easier. But yeah, we have a strong witness. And behind that, we have many other fields of data waiting to testify. The little blobs on the left, I don't know where they sit in court, actually. So that's the evidence. It's only the tip of the iceberg. But I hope tonight or this morning or wherever you are, this is informative. Cheers, Ash. I think I'm done and I will stop sharing. Okay.
Right. Thank you so much for that. That was awesome. I think that's so incredible that there's so much evidence outside of the Bible. Confirmation that we can be sure of these facts as much as any other historical event that we've evidence for. That Jesus lived and he died, and that something must have happened because the church grew explosively. If they didn't have good reason to believe that, oh, this guy was God, then they wouldn't have grown. They would have died right there, right then. But it didn't. So did something happen? If he died, that would have been it. So the resurrection something must have happened. They must have seen something. So this is a powerful case. And once again, this isn't a scientific case. We don't need scientific evidence. We saw that God exists. Miracles are possible. The question is, did this happen? Did Jesus rise from the dead? And this is a powerful case. It's about as sure a fact as anything could be about the historical world. So the question now that everyone should be asking, okay, what would I need? What would we expect if this actually happened? If this happened, I wouldn't even expect that much, with it being a fact that happened 2,000 years ago. So if someone's going to deny this, the question is, what would you need? Are you being reasonable, or are you letting your biases get in the way? If you hold on to your preconceived decision before the evidence, then you're just wasting your time. It's counterintuitive. So the question is, what would you need? This is about as sure a historical fact as anything, and it's possible. Did it happen? It looks like it. So if this happened, then Jesus's claims are confirmed. Christianity is true. I'm going to say that again. Christianity is true based on the evidence. So now we're going to be going over in the next couple of weeks, if it's true, what are the implications? There's not only the Old Testament, but if Jesus is confirmed, he affirmed the Old Testament. That's confirmed as well. So what do we do with tricky Old Testament passages? New Testament looks like it's a God of love, but what about Old Testament passages? You know, the slaughter of the Canaanites, all this terrible stuff. What about Isaac? Abraham was going to kill him. What do we do with this? We want to affirm this God. We see that he exists. Jesus was God, but what do we do with this? If that's the God, I don't know that I want him. So that's what we're going to go over the next couple of weeks. So if you're interested, then that's what we'll be doing. You can find it on our YouTube channel. And so having said that, if you have any questions about today's presentation for Chris, go ahead and drop those in the chat. And we'll wait for that. I don't know if Arthur, if you have any questions you'd like to ask.
Oh, that was awesome. That was like overwhelmingly awesome. I was not expecting that. I only knew of like Tacitus, Josephus, and then like my actual biblical evidence. I knew it existed. That was just really, really awesome. Thank you, Chris.
That's all right. I'm glad I could help.
Yeah,
it was a bit long, but
yeah, it's kind of funny because like when you become familiar with the New Testament and then you read what these guys are saying, like and you actually know the details of the accounts. So like the whole darkness thing at his crucifixion, the whole earthquake thing, the fact that they mentioned he went to Egypt, and it's funny because you read in like Matthew or you read in the other Gospels, and it's saying, well, these are fulfillments of prophecies. Like just about Egypt, like out of my son, or I'll call my son out of Egypt because he went to Egypt and then an angel said it's safe for you to leave, or God told him it's safe for him to leave. So like just seeing these people talk about this stuff, and even when they're opposed to it, it's kind of revealing. It's very revealing, and I thought that was awesome. One thing that I was always interested in is like how did this anti-Jesus like sentiment arise? Because like nowadays, especially like in places like Israel, you could look at just evidence from channels like One for Israel. There's super anti-Jesus sentiment within the Jewish nation today, and I was always confused how the development of Jews versus Christians arose. I understand that Jesus was a Jew and then he was crucified because of what the Jewish leaders said, but it just always seemed strange to me. Or even how historical Christians were anti-Semitic. I don't know if it's just like they didn't think about this. Do you have any comments about that?
This is actually a question I found really interesting. I just thought this is something when I was reading N.T. Wright about his origins of Christian, but I was just like, so wait, am I technically a Jew? But there were distinguishments were made just because of the divide that happened. So the way I sort of timeline it is, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. So he considered himself a Jewish Messiah. The disciples considered themselves Jews, followers of Christ. So he was the Jewish Christ. But then there were many Jews who didn't agree with the followers of Christ. So you have Jews disagreeing and those who follow Christ. So you have Christ and then you have Jews. And then to say, oh, I'm a Jew and I believe in Jesus, this became a real problem. So, and you notice that verse, it says, and they were first named Christians in Antioch. Basically, Christians was not a compliment. Ian in Christian means little. Oh, look, there's those little Christs running around. That's what they started to call them. They were mocking them. And you know what they did? They took the label on as a badge of honor. Said, you know what? You're mocking us Jews for being Christians, being little Christs. We're going to take that on as a badge of honor. We are Christians. We are little Christs. We are running around following Christ. We'll take it on as a badge of honor. So that seems to be the beginning of the rift. That's where it seems to be the beginning of the rift. And I think you have, obviously, the Pharisees are not friends with Christ. And basically, I think it just kind of distinguishes wider and wider apart till it just becomes clear that, look, we understand there's a Jewish origin to Christ, but to call yourself a Jew is to not believe Jesus is the Messiah. So part of me argues we're Old Testament, but we're New Testament. You cannot have the New Testament without the Old, but for us, we cannot have the Old without the New. So we are Old New Testament Jew Christian things. I think it's come around for practicality, I would say. Like Michael, I'm sure you've heard of Michael Brown, who would put himself as a Messianic Jew. So he was a Jew who came to believe in Jesus. He considers himself a Messianic Jew. So a Messianic Jew would make a lot of sense. We are Jews who believe in the Messiah. We believe in the Jewish beliefs. Jesus, of course, escalates some of the teachings, but Michael Brown calls himself a Messianic Jew. I could be wrong on, maybe there's a nuanced belief to that, but generally that's my understanding. And through the history, like I told you, the Toledot Yeshu around 1000 AD, there were lots of anti-Christian documents, and the Christians weren't exactly polite to the Jews in many cases. Martin Luther tried to convert many Jews, and when they just shut him out, he then started going anti-Jew. So the anti-Semitism came out of his frustration to convert and things like that. So don't quote me on that. I'm not a Protestant historian, but I know there was some conflict there. But then Martin Luther may dislike some other groups as well. It's not just that. It's just one of many he clashed with and things like that. So it's not a case of, it's only Jews. No, I think it was a clash because I think he tried to lead them to Christ, but that didn't happen. And it got frustrating, I believe. I don't know the ins and outs. I'm not your best reformed theologian. But yeah, that to me is the sort of the origin of the divide. So if someone said, you're essentially a Jew who believes in Jesus and you take on Jesus's advancement of the Jewish teachings, I would say, yeah, that makes sense. It's true. It's the logical growth. The Old Testament predicts the Messiah. We believe in the Messiah. So you can see how the two, I mean, we've not deleted the Old Testament and pretending like it never existed. That would be, some have tried to do that, but that's crazy. And most people who do that, we probably call heretics.
Yeah. Yeah, that was awesome. So one thing I noticed was it seemed like it could have just been like for the sake of time, but the actual theology of why Jesus died seems to be absent. They just record, and obviously there's like most of them are historians, that at least the ones you cited today. And so it's just so interesting that the New Testament was like made such a big deal that even the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was saying. And then Paul later kind of made it more clear, but Jesus understood and his disciples didn't. This is why I'm dying. And then all these other people said, so this was attested to because they're historians and stuff like that. And then the other thing is, this whole idea that like this rift between Christians and Jews, like One for Israel is one of my favorite channels, and so many of the people with testimonies on there, they say, and they're Messianic Jews, and they say, I grew up raised in the synagogue, like somewhere in New York, and a lot of them come from New York, the ones that are on the channel, and they say, I believe Jesus was a Catholic. And it just shows how misrepresented like Jesus is to so many different groups. And so, I mean, we could all contribute to misrepresentations, but we could also contribute to like proper ones. And then Dan said, you touched on it a bit, but I've heard people who get stuck on the idea of Josephus' text being manipulated and basically just use that to discredit all his writings as well, and question the authenticity of writings of others. Do you have any advice in addressing this?
So when it comes to the topic of Josephus, this is why I spent about 10 minutes on it. And this was specifically why. So you have this interpolation passage. This is the Greek. You then have this reconstruction by Professor John P. Meyer, whose job is, he did a reconstruction based on all these historical methods for what it might likely say, based on the tone and context of it. It doesn't, to him, he would never remove it, but say, well, yeah, someone's added to this. To remove the passage, it didn't make any sense considering he understood Josephus very well. So we have this interpolation, we have the reconstruction, and when we find this untouched Arabic manuscript, basically we have this Arabic manuscript, being blunt, these guys didn't get a hold of. So while they're editing and interpolating this one-off, the reason why they've taken this Josephus passage is, for an apologetic back then, this is one of those few passages you think we might actually use this. Yet thousands of Greek and Roman historian documents they preserved perfectly, but this specific one they played around with. Why? Because, as we said, the Christians liked Josephus. He was a decent guy. But we have this Arabic manuscript of Josephus that they didn't get a hold of. Why? Well, it's an Arabic manuscript. That was probably the reason. They just didn't do Arabic. So you've got this Arabic version. I don't know the full history behind it. All I know is we have a 10th century Arabic version of Josephus that has survived. And the reason why it helps is there's no interpolation on it. Everything he says in that sounds like Josephus. Nothing sounds like someone else. So, for example, this is a brief example. In the book of Acts, Luke is writing. So I believe the authorship of Luke Acts is Dr. Luke, the physician Luke. Now, we can't see it in the English, but most times Luke is writing like a posh chap from London. Actually, no, sorry. London's more Cockney. I'm English, so I can justify those things. But then when Peter actually speaks, Luke is actually pasting in a quote. He's quoting a speech, and many non-Christian historians say, "Oh, this is an early speech that goes back to, let's say, the 30s AD." And what the author of Acts has done is he's quoted him and he's pasted in the quote. And the reason why he knows that is the language changes. At one minute, you've got the poshest person speaking in the world. Then he quotes Peter, and Peter sounds like some dude who, I don't know, doesn't sound as witty. Might sound a bit Cockney. All right, mate, here's my little speech. And then you've got Luke, who sounds like the poshest chap in the world. Basically, what I'm saying in a nutshell is they sound different. And we would expect that sort of thing to happen in Josephus if it was fake. However, Josephus sounds like Josephus for thousands of pages. I mean, I've got Josephus's work. It's over 1,000 pages. And the way you can determine whether it's an interpolation is, does he sound like Josephus all the way? Now, when you look at the Shlomo Pines passage, without the interpolation, he sounds like Josephus. If you read anywhere else in Josephus, it sounds like him. I sound a certain way. If I started speaking in a Brummie accent, or I started speaking in, I don't know, American slang, I would sound like a different person. If I wrote like that, you'd be like, wait a minute, I've read 20 pages from this guy, and suddenly he sounds very different. Something's not right here. And you would know, did I write that? If I did, why did I suddenly change my tone to sound really different? That's what they see. So with the Shlomo Pines passage, there aren't any issues with it. The only issue you could say is, oh, it's 10th century, but it's a 10th century version of the earlier version. So generally, I think it's pretty good. If you didn't want to use Shlomo Pines, then you have a really good interpolation, a really good mended version by John P. Meyer. But I think the Arabic version is fine. Sorry, I'm getting a pop noise on my headphone. Hopefully you're not hearing that.
Any other questions? All right, just give them another chance. What would you say is the most powerful or interesting case against the historicity of the resurrection? And what is your response to it?
Of course, I have to respond to it. The most interesting response specifically to the case for the resurrection.
Yes.
Gosh, I think they're all awful. I suppose stolen body's pretty terrible. Twin theory's a lot worse. There are different versions of delusion, vision, hallucination. I've had TLE thrown my way. I suppose I would still have to pin it on the hallucination as the strongest one. Basically, in my articles, I do a series of charts and tables, and that one has the most ticks. It has, out of like 10 criteria you need to meet, the resurrection hits 10 criteria, right? I think the hallucination hits 2.5. So I would say that's the strongest one. the problem with the hallucination, even just using the minimal facts argument, but you should use the maximal facts because that uses all the data. But even on the minimal facts, which is just using the non-Christian data, I know everyone's not a fan of minimal facts. I like a hybrid of the two because I can't share the maximal facts with someone in a pub. If this was 1 hour, imagine an 8-hour conversation in the pub just so you heard the maximal case. I don't have time for that. And they don't have time for that. They want to hear a short answer. So on the minimal facts, the facts which are generally grounded is Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples truly believed they saw Jesus risen from the dead. James, same story, and he's a skeptic. Paul, Christian killer, believes he saw the risen Jesus. And even though it's not a minimal fact, which is 90%, the empty tomb is still beyond 75%, which is still the majority. So I take it. And secondly, I've got an article on about, I think it's about 20 reasons, 20 facts why we should believe in the empty tomb based on external evidences to do with that. When you've got those 5 facts in place, a hallucination, firstly, it cannot deal with the empty tomb because you can just go into the tomb and see if there's a real body. If you've hallucinated, there will be a body there. Secondly, the best argument you could have is, oh, maybe the disciples hallucinated. Well, based on the Jewish context, Jesus was not the first one to claim to be the Messiah. The rule is, and N.T. Wright says this in his massive 800 book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. When you go through the different messiahs, when a messiah turns up and dies, the first thing you do is you look for a new messiah. Do you know why? Because that one failed. So the first thing they would have thought when Jesus died and he didn't, bring forth his kingdom, they were like, right. They felt pretty distraught. They felt wretched. They ran away. Only John was there at the cross. So they're not doing great. This is pretty embarrassing to admit that there's only one dude left at the cross and his mum. So one of his best mates and his mum's at the cross. The rest of them fled. This is looking pretty awkward. Yet they're absolute heroes and champions 3 days later. And then there's the inauguration in Acts and it's go time. So you could argue they hallucinated, but why would they? Why would they suddenly break the trend from every other belief about every other fake Jewish Messiah? Doesn't hold ground for me. James was a pious Jew. We see that in the New Testament texts, and Josephus informs us about his view. He would have been distraught that his brother was a heretic and would have been on the same side of the Pharisees. Get this kid out. And when we do see James mentioned, he is not seen as a fan of Jesus. In fact, you get that passage where Jesus says there is no honor in he has no honor in this hometown, something around that. And then Paul, why on earth would Paul, who killed Christians for a living, suddenly start picking up on Jesus? You could try and say, oh, there's this for Paul, there's this for the empty tomb. Then you've got 5 different theories, which are all bold in themselves. And then you say, I'm going to take these 5 crazy theories and put them all together. There's a reason why conspiracy theories tend not to work, because they require lots of conspiracies. And if we take 5 conspiracies, which are all highly implausible, and then we put them all together to create a super implausible case, I think the resurrection is a lot more convincing, especially if you've established God exists. Then you've got this super conspiracy with no historical documentation that no one wrote down that happened, that nothing has survived of this super anti-Christian theory. To me, that's one of the strongest ones. It's a kind of a combination theory. The combination theory is the strongest because it has an answer for all 5. The reason why it fails is because the answers are pretty terrible. So that's the best one I can think of.
I love just hearing that you said that they're all terrible, because I think that's an important point. Just that, okay, to have to deny the resurrection that occurred, you really have to bend over backwards because of all the facts that we have. I think that that's another interesting thing, that there is a point where you can say, okay, I'm believing in something that didn't happen. Some say, oh no, I just lack a belief that happened. But no, if we've all these facts, all these details, and you still want to say, no, that didn't happen, that's not a lack of belief. That's a positive belief that didn't happen. So I think that's really interesting that, okay, if you're going to deny this, you're going to try to think of another theory, which, like you said, they all fail for big reasons. That's that you have a positive belief that didn't happen. So it's on you then, because the evidence is pointing in a direct, clear direction. So that's awesome. The last question in here is kind of related to the last 2 we're going to ask. So first, what advice would you give to yourself when you started out in the world of apologetics? What would you want to tell yourself then that you know now?
Buy books on Kindle. I have a lot of books, but honestly, I I'm in a position where I don't really spend much time on fashion. Like all my clothes are plain and boring and usually 2 for £10. So I have a lot more money for books and Kindle and Audible. What I would do is if a book exists on Audible or Kindle, I would get it. Physical books are very nice and look pretty and sometimes fill a space. And it's nice to have, like some of the books I have here, purely because either they don't have a Kindle version or they're just better as a book and I can take it on the go or something like that. But I would definitely use Audible because you can put things at times 2 speed, because most times when you read a book, you're not reading at times 1 speed. You're probably reading at times 1.5 to times 2 sometimes, or times 3 if you're really brave. So there you can go through 300-page books in 4 or 5 hours. I would tell myself, do that. Christian Apologist are clicking on that. We should be getting our books on Audible. We should be getting them on Kindle at a minimum. And when you find these big books coming out, they're on Audible. So I would definitely use Audible, Kindle. I would try to find all-encompassing books and not lots of individual books. So I started looking up textual criticism, and I have about 25 books on textual criticism. But I've concluded I have 3 books that say everything the other books need to say. So I was like, nuts. So try not to just say, that book's £1.40. It's from 1998. I'll buy it. And then I've bought lots and lots of cheap books. I've got I can get 15 great books for £25. But there's this one all-encompassing book that's slightly more expensive that would have saved me a lot of money. So buy more all-encompassing books. Another thing I would do is find out these apologists, these scholars, like the Gary Habermases, the Mike Laconas, Craig Keeners, another Craig Blomberg. There's a third Craig in that somewhere. Anyway, one thing I've noticed is you can email these guys, and provided you give them a nice short question, hi, how are you? I have this question, and I know you're the expert. What do you think of this? And I've had responses from Gary Habermas, from Craig Evans. I don't think that I've ever not had a Christian scholar respond. Do you know why? Because they want to answer your questions. Like, I'm not a scholar. I'm just a layman, but I like to ask questions, and I like to not give rambling long questions. I give rambling long answers, but I can write short questions. So email the scholars, find scholars in the Christian field, and ask them what they think. Use Audible, use Kindle, save yourself time. Set up a spreadsheet so you have an apologetic schedule, because apologetics is very addictive. And it's also, apologetics is not there to destroy people, because if you want to, you can find someone who's a Jesus misethist, absolutely destroy them, and lose your friendship. That's not a good idea. I'm sure there's a great hype in destroying someone with apologetics, but it's a tool you need to sort of use wisely. And I did that once, and I was like, oh, you idiot. I may never talk to that person again now, because they think I'm the most obnoxious, rude person in the world. I'm like, was it worth it? No. And I apologized. So a little bit of common sense when getting into apologetics, because when you feel like you have this knowledge is power. Well, knowledge is dangerous because you can use it to your advantage. So 1 Peter 3:15 and verse 16, gentleness and respect, humbly and kindly. And it says something like that. So that's my general advice.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, one more question before we let you log off, so move on to our praise time. So, okay, what are the 2 top book recommendations? So say someone's not a big reader and they only say have time for 2 books. What would you say? What are 2 must-read books on the resurrection?
On the resurrection?
Yes.
Not the external evidence. I'll find it in a second. I would say on the resurrection, I like the minimal facts one, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas. Though I have a really beefy book somewhere. There we go. If I can get it off the shelf without knocking all my books off. Evidence That Demands a Verdict. That sort of has a huge chapter on the resurrection, and it goes through internal evidence, external evidence. It's one of those books where it gives you a short amount for everything, and then you need to buy another book to go in depth. But if you're getting into Christian apologetics, this is one of those books that it's sort of like, this is one book instead of 40 books. So it will cover textual criticism. It will cover the case for the resurrection. It will cover external evidence. It won't do it as in depth as the presentation, say, we've done today. There you would want a book like Jesus Outside the New Testament by Robert van der Wurst, who he will go through what I've done for about 300 pages. So that's a more specific book. So The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas. I think I've just found that. Ta-da! Nice, and keep it nice and clean. And the best thing is, it comes with a disc, which is a quiz on how well you know the book. And I think unless you get 100% right, you fail the quiz. So read the book very carefully and then take the quiz. Not everyone's a fan of the minimal facts, but it's good to know. I know there's a dividing Christian opinion on it, but know the minimal facts case and learn the maximal facts case. And you're kind of ready for anything, really, because it covers most types of resurrection conversation. Because after someone's convinced of the minimal facts, they may want to go more into why the New Testament is reliable. Well, then you've got they may not. I know some who aren't interested. If Jesus rose from the dead, that is all that matters. Some want that, but then they're just like, I just want to be more confident in the New Testament first. It depends. You don't need to, but it's either or. It depends on the person.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So if you want to find his stuff, then be sure to check out Instagram 1C15 Apologetics, and definitely go to the website 1c15.co.uk. So thank you for coming.
That's all right. Cheers, guys. It's been fun.